Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we are continuing our reading of Lavender and Red by Feinberg with sections 17 through 20. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, we've been reading from Lavender and Red for some time. You can find a playlist of all of the recorded sections here on the channel. I'll put a link to that in the video description. There are 120 parts altogether, so this is a pretty long series. By the end of this segment, we're just going to be 1/5 of the way through, so plenty more to come. And these articles were originally published in the Workers' World newspaper between 2004 and 2008 by Feinberg. And we want to thank the Workers' World Party for making this available under a Creative Commons license. It is hosted at workers.org. So let's begin. Part 17. Anti-Gay Terror in Nazi Germany. When it came to turning around prejudices and discrimination against same-sex love, the newly formed German Democratic Republic had to clean up the toxic waste dump of centuries of class prejudice. The GDR faced particularly huge obstacles in carrying out this onerous task. The Nazi state had been defeated in 1945 not in a revolution from below, but by the advancing Soviet army. The German population as a whole had been fed 12 years of Nazi propaganda, including demonizing and dehumanizing cant about homosexual men and women. After the war, Germany was partitioned by the Allied powers. In the eastern sector, after 4 years of Soviet occupation in which not only the Nazis but the bourgeois class behind them were removed from power, the German Democratic Republic was established in 1949 and began to construct a socialist economy. The mass German homosexual emancipation movement had been crushed during the rise of fascism. Many thousands of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans activists had perished in the death camps. The Soviet Union was in the grip of its own political regression concerning male homosexuality. As the leader of the Communist International, the Soviet Union's political retreat had an impact on the world movement and the positions it took on gay rights. The revolutionary struggles in Germany and Russia were intrinsically connected. The crushing of the November 1918 revolution in Germany had dealt a blow to the young Soviet workers' state, which had hoped that class solidarity, material aid, and economic cooperation from a more technologically developed socialist country would soon be on its way. The face of counter-revolution. After years of economic crisis and the growth of a large but divided workers' movement, Hitler's party got the support of the big German capitalists in 1933 to crush any resistance to their rule. In the violent repression that followed, aimed first at the communists and the left generally, both anti-Semitism and anti-homosexual terror were raised to heights not seen in Europe since the feudal Inquisition. Once he became second in command in the Nazi Party, Heinrich Himmler, chief of the SS stormtroopers as well as the police, on June 17, 1936, created the Federal Security Office for combating abortion and homosexuality. Himmler had included homosexuality as one of 4 illnesses that threatened the existence of Germany. He vowed, quote, "Like stinging nettles, we will rip them out." Hey, nettles are actually really good for you. "Throw them on a heap and burn them. Otherwise, without being able to fight it, we'll see the end of Germany, the end of the Germanic world," unquote. Today, the pink triangle has become recognized around the world as the emblem that those labeled homosexual were forced to wear in German concentration camps. Some were gay, others were accused of same-sex fantasies, or fell victim to trumped-up charges by opponents. Estimates of the total number of prisoners forced to wear the pink triangle on their uniforms in Nazi concentration camps range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. German historian Richard Plant, in his now classic book, The Pink Triangle, The Nazi War Against Homosexuals, estimated that between 50,000 and 63,000 males were convicted of violating paragraph 175, the Prussian anti-homosexual law, from 1933 to 1944. More than 25,000 youths were convicted between 1933 and 1940. Some 3,976 were between 14 and 18 years old. Plant, who fled Frankfurt am Main on February 27, 1933, the day the Reichstag burned to the ground and several weeks after the arrest of his Jewish socialist father, wrote that, quote, "From 1935 on, every gay German man knew that if he was caught, he risked being shipped to a concentration camp. There, disease, degradation, and almost certain death awaited him," unquote. Those who survived faced castration. Although Himmler made no known statements railing against lesbians, Plant added, quote, "Nevertheless, some, albeit very few, German lesbians were caught in the machinery of the secret police," unquote. He noted that, quote, "The major campaign against Germany's homosexuals, which began after the Rome Purge, lasted until about 1939 or 1940, when most German men joined the armed forces. Because Himmler's Gestapo agents had no jurisdiction over the military, it offered a relatively safe refuge for most homosexuals of military age," unquote. As the German military machine rolled over national boundaries in Europe, gays in Alsace-Lorraine and Holland, lands expected to become part of the new Reich, also faced death if captured. All German laws were applied to the people of Alsace-Lorraine, including the newly amended paragraph 175. However, the anti-homosexual rampage and violent targeting of the German homosexual emancipation movement was mainly an internal campaign aimed at Germans. It was part and parcel of the domestic counter-revolution that smashed the organization of millions of communists, socialists, and progressives, crushing the trade unions and all vehicles of working-class organization. German capital, which controlled few colonies, had to take over new markets, extract raw materials of new territories, and superexploit a vast labor force. Like all its competitors, it had to expand or die. The German industrialists and financiers thought that the Nazis had both the will and the means to carry out this military expansion: rocket technology, a strong air force and panzer tank divisions, and a military-industrial complex. But by the end of the war, Imperial Germany lay devastated and defeated, a significant part of its territory under the control of its mortal enemies, the Communists. The workers' state in the East now had to pick up the pieces and change social relations. And in the struggle to build new social relations in the workers' state, gays and lesbians made great strides. Part 18. Denazification in Socialist Germany opened the door to gay rights. Three major English-language sources written over the course of a decade and a half offered rich examples of the advances for gays and lesbians that took place in the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, after it was established in 1949. Canadian historian Jim Stakely wrote the earliest of these accounts, Gays Under Socialism, Male Homosexuality in the German Democratic Republic. The article, containing material from his 7 months of research in the GDR during the 1970s, appeared in the December 1976, January 1977 issue of The Body Politic. A noteworthy contribution of Stakely's extensive research was his initial admonition that each socialist country has local features that it inherits from its past and its material realities. He was followed by John Parsons, who made 4 research trips to the GDR over a 6-year period. Parsons elaborated on the arduous political task the young workers' state had inherited. In his published findings, a 10-page article entitled East Germany Faces Its Past, A New Start for Socialist Sexual Politics, published in Outlook, summer 1989, he wrote, quote, "The work of both the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and the Communist Party was put to an end with the Nazi rise to power. Homosexuals, communists, social democrats, and especially Jews were all ruthlessly persecuted and murdered. Quote, the Nazis succeeded, moreover, he continued, in thoroughly tearing out the roots of cooperation that had existed among various people on the issue of sexuality. During the Nazis' 12-year rule, they reorganized the medical, legal, and teaching professions, promoting confirmed Nazi ideologues, searching out those who were not, or in today's parlance, going after the, quote, deep state, and raising a generation on Nazi propaganda. What few threads of the earlier cooperations the Nazis themselves did not destroy, the devastation of the war, and the battle lines drawn in the Cold War finished off," unquote. Even before the founding of the German Democratic Republic on October 6, 1949, the United States and Britain were maneuvering to stop socialist revolution from spreading across Germany. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Red Army had crushed the Nazi invaders and forced them to retreat westward. As the collapsing army of German imperialism fled, the Red Army marched into Berlin and the fascists were defeated. But under pressure and threats from the US and British, the Soviet Army was forced to pull back. Nazis, uprooted versus replanted. After the defeat of fascism, Germans in the East, with Soviet help, worked to root out the Nazis and their capitalist collaborators and mobilize the population to rebuild. Stickley offered an overview of conditions for gays and lesbians. His particular focus was on gay men, in the period of anti-fascist democratic renewal from 1945 to 49. He wrote, quote, "During this period of denazification, the gay scene in the Soviet-occupied zone was marked by a rapid recovery from the genocidally homophobic politics of German fascism. Homosexuals came out of hiding or returned from concentration camps, and gay bars began to reopen in both the East and the West. Overall," he added, "the denazification program carried out in the Soviet-occupied zone was far more aggressive and thorough than those in the Western zones," unquote. In fact, in the West, the occupying forces of imperialism tried to prop up capitalist rule with massive infusions of financial aid, most from the U.S. Marshall Plan, while permitting tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals to emigrate or to re-enter Bonn's political arena. The United States and Britain allowed these former Nazis to resume their place in West German industry and government because they were the anti-communist bulwark. Richard Plant emphasized this point in a June 1990 article in Outweek. Title, East German Journal, East German Gay Laws Years Ahead of West. Plant had been forced to flee Germany on the day of the infamous 1933 Reichstag fire that Hitler used to consolidate his power, 9/11. After the war, he wrote, quote, "East German leaders tried to indict and convict as many high-ranking former Nazis as possible. The West German government, on the other hand, continued to employ some notorious Nazis in high positions long after the beloved Führer's suicide," unquote. The first Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, who was approved by the U.S. occupiers, continued to keep Hans Globke as his Secretary of the Chancellery despite protests. Plant explained, quote, "Globke was instrumental in drafting Nazi laws, enacted during the 1930s, which deprived Jews of their citizenship," unquote. Even after an East German court indicted Globke in absentia in 1950, Adenauer would not budge. Quote, "Neither did Adenauer rescind the tough anti-gay Nazi decrees of 1935, which, for example, declared that a man observed, quote, glancing lewdly at another man, could be taken into police custody," unquote. That law, paragraph 175A, was a Nazi amendment to the 1871 Prussian anti-homosexual, paragraph 175. The amendment allowed the Nazis to criminalize and snare those they accused of even homosexual fantasies or intent. In the East, that Nazi amendment, paragraph 175A, was immediately removed from the books. Stickley stressed that in the GDR, quote, "the immediate benefit for gay people came with the repeal of paragraph 175A, the Nazi law which had led to the arrest and imprisonment of tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of homosexuals. This law was struck down by the Superior State Court of Halle in 1948. By contrast, it remained in effect in West Germany until 1969. Unquote. Paragraph 175, however, the Prussian law against male homosexuality that had long been part of German criminal code, remained on the books in the Soviet-occupied zone. It made sex between men punishable by up to 4 years in jail. The law remained on the books in West Germany, too. Picking up the torch. Parsons gave thoughtful attention to the early struggles in the East to repeal paragraph 175 itself. Quote, "At the end of the war," he explained, "the earlier difference within the Communist Party again appeared as a discussion arose about how to reconstruct the society. Some people argued that the democratic reconstruction of the country should include progressive reforms of the laws and customs regarding sexuality. Articles appeared in many newspapers advocating the elimination of paragraph 175. In Saxony, which later became a part of East Germany, the legislature endorsed the repeal of the paragraph." Unquote. One communist in particular deserves credit for these efforts, Dr. Rudolf Klimmer. As a medical student in Dresden during the Weimar Republic, Klimmer, a gay man, had traveled to Berlin many times to follow developments within the homosexual emancipation movement. He particularly developed an association with Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee. Klimmer was a member of the Communist Party. So was the committee's secretary and later chairperson, Richard Linzert. During 12 long years of fascism, Klimmer kept his political views and sexuality under wraps, marrying a lesbian for mutual protection. After the Nazis were defeated, he chose to live in the Soviet-occupied zone and joined the Communist Party once again. Stakely noted, quote, "He launched a one-man campaign which aimed at repealing all laws against homosexuality, re-establishing Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, and agitating with Soviet and local authorities for the full equality of gay people." Klimmer, Stakely said, quote, "also embarked upon a career similar to Hirschfeld's, continuing his medical practice and appearing as an expert witness in numerous court cases involving homosexuals, arguing at every turn for the repeal of paragraph 175, unquote. Although his tireless efforts were successful in helping to overturn the amendment to paragraph 175, he was not able to repeal the old law itself, nor was he able to win the establishment of a new Institute for Sexual Science. Instead, he was appointed medical director of Dresden's Polyclinic, where he set up the first marriage and sexual counseling center of the Soviet-occupied zone, which became a forerunner of dozens of similar centers across the GDR. Cleaning up the old cesspool. John Parsons examined the struggle for sexual liberation in a material context. He stressed that the efforts of Klimmer and others proved to be exceptional for two key reasons. The GDR had to pull itself up out of the ashes of wartime devastation: hunger, homelessness, dislocation, and poverty. The USSR, unlike the United States, had suffered tremendous destruction during the war and had no resources to send to Eastern Europe. Furthermore, quote, "a generation of children had been raised and educated in Nazi schools. The problems of denazifying the country, of creating new, democratic educational programs and new legal and medical professions took center stage. The Communist Party turned its attention to mobilizing the population for the barest of economic needs and towards stabilizing social life in the most orthodox of all structures," unquote. The second cause, he wrote, quote, "lies with developments in the communist movement itself," unquote. The rise of a bureaucratic current in the Soviet leadership and the re-establishment of an anti-gay law in the USSR were to have an impact in East Germany as well. Quote, "Stalin's rise ended the Communist Party's advocacy of sexual reform. The same reversal occurred in Germany, with the growth of the influence of Stalinism throughout the world communist movement. As a result," he stated, quote, "between 1948 and the late 1960s, lesbian and gay liberation lost any place in broad public discussions," unquote. Stakely concluded that during the period of the anti-fascist democratic renewal, quote, "homosexuals were generally able to return to the place in German society which they had held before Hitler's rise to power," unquote, gains that had been made possible in the Weimar Republic because of the mass German homosexual emancipation movement, but no further. However, the work to provide jobs, education, housing, and healthcare for the East German population as a whole continued to raise living standards. As material conditions improved, the struggle for sexual emancipation reached new heights. Part 19. Legal and Material Progress. After World War II, as productivity and social reorganization in the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, rose to meet the needs of the population as a whole, the more specific needs of individuals and groups within society, including gay men and lesbians, could be more easily addressed. Canadian researcher Jim Stakely, who published the results of 7 months of research in East Germany in 1976, outlined some of the concrete conditions under which East German workers tried to construct a planned economy, socialism. He paid careful attention to the period between the establishment of the GDR in 1949 and the construction of the defensive Berlin Wall in 1961. Quote, "With the formal founding of the GDR in 1949, the Cold War hostilities between socialism and capitalism intensified and entered a period of chronic crisis. The West used every means at its disposal to destroy the GDR, ranging from economic sabotage to CIA subversion," unquote. He noted that a calculated brain drain lured away some 10% of the GDR's population, mostly middle-class professionals, and that a campaign of smuggling across the open border also served to bleed the resources of the workers' state. Quote, "By subsidizing the costs of food, rents, and basic commodities, the GDR held living expenses at their 1945 level, which they continue to have today," he wrote at the end of 1976. Faced with costs 5 to 10 times higher at home, many West Germans did all of their shopping in the GDR, particularly in Berlin. Thus, the GDR made relatively slow economic and social advances during this period, which was closed in 1961 by the construction of the tragically necessary wall along the border between the German states," unquote. During the period between 1949 and 1961, he said, the gay scene in both Germanys was generally similar. Gays could visit a variety of clubs on either side of the border. He added, however, that some gays from the GDR felt uncomfortable about their clothing not being considered as fashionable, and the price of drinks was steep in the West. However, he added, considering that at 17 million the GDR had only about 30% of the population of West Germany, quote, the GDR matched the West in terms of subcultural institutions such as dance bars, steam baths, access to homophile periodicals, and so on. And he stressed, West Germany was scarcely a haven for homosexuals during these years. Ruled by the Christian Democratic Party, the name tells it all, the federal government was adamantly opposed to law reform, which might improve the situation of gay people, and local authorities were extremely intolerant of the gay subculture. Police entrapment and raids on bars and baths, unheard of in the GDR, were common in the West, unquote. The published curator's notes from a 1997 Berlin art exhibit commemorating the 100th anniversary of the German homosexual emancipation movement stated that the number of convictions of individuals accused under the anti-gay statutes in West Germany was 1,920 in 1950. By 1959, the number soared to as many as 3,530, an all-time record. Quote, even people not sentenced suffered a great deal, the exhibit curators pointed out, as employers and family members found out in the course of proceedings that they were gay, unquote. Progress, not perfection. The Nazi anti-gay amendment was immediately struck from the laws of the newly created German Democratic Republic in 1949. Formally, the old Prussian paragraph 175 remained on the books in the GDR, but the activist efforts of Dr. Rudolf Klimmer, a gay communist and physician, during the 1950s had an impact. Stakely explained that Klimmer set out to win the support of prominent people in the GDR for the campaign to rescind paragraph 175 and win full equality for homosexuals. Quote, his efforts were strongly backed by the GDR's then Minister of Justice, Hilda Benjamin. She urged the repeal of paragraph 175 in the country's leading legal journals. There was, and still is, a high degree of acceptance of homosexuals within the cultural sector of the GDR, he reported. But the GDR's then Minister of Culture, the poet Johannes R. Becker, refused to take a public stand on law reform, unquote. Becker's homosexuality was well known since West German reporters had outed his relationship with a male construction worker. Quote, Klimmer did, however, receive the support of numerous other agencies and individuals, including one of the GDR's most famous writers, Ludwig Renn, a party veteran whose novels frequently turned on gay themes, unquote. The 1950s and 1960s were defined not by perfection, however, but by progress. Backward views about root causes of homosexuality still circulated, and when Klimmer wrote a 1959 opus to answer this old prejudice, he couldn't find a publisher in the East. Klimmer had written that only two things differentiate homosexuals from heterosexuals, the object of sexual attraction and social discrimination. However, Stakely wrote, quote, Klimmer's efforts during this period were rewarded by the judicial decision in 1957 to discontinue prosecutions on the basis of paragraph 175 except in cases involving assault, coercion, or minors, unquote. Gains in the East pushed the West to follow. The year 1961 marked a period of economic change in the GDR that brought social change in its wake. Quote, beginning in 1961, Stakely continued, the GDR finally took measures which had been long delayed, the complete collectivization of farmlands and the expropriation of privately owned stores and industries. Since most bars and baths were privately owned and managed up to 1961, this had a direct impact upon the urban gay scene, unquote. However, Stakely found that virtually every city with a population of more than 50,000 had a gay bar. Dresden and Leipzig each had 4, and Berlin had 5 and a steam bath. In some cases, these state-owned clubs were frequented by heterosexual patrons in the daytime and gay clientele in the evenings. Quote, frictions have developed when a homophobic manager was assigned to a gay bar, he concluded, but such managers generally request a transfer after a short time, unquote. At last, in 1968, the hated paragraph 175 was removed from law books after almost a century of struggle since its inception in 1871, but only in the GDR. Richard Plant, a Jewish gay man forced to flee Germany in 1933, hailed this progressive move in his 1990 article, East German Gay Laws, Years Ahead of West. Plant wrote that, quote, finally in 1968, perhaps spurred on by sexologists, scientists, and gay activists, East Germany revoked all penalties concerning sexual relations between consenting male adults. This caused consternation for the leaders of other Eastern European nations. Officials in Prague, Budapest, and Bucharest were bewildered. Quote, "But more troubled were conservative power brokers of West Germany." Unquote. Plant said the legislative move by the GDR pushed West Germany to follow. Quote, "In 1969, the Bonn government began timidly to draw up new regulations. The legislators, however, were so scared of right-wing fanatics that another year passed before the rulings resembled those drafted in the East." Unquote. While the welcome legal move in the GDR did not, in and of itself, wipe out centuries of homophobia that lingered as a legacy of class society, the Communist Party in the GDR would soon demonstrate what strides in social progress could be made when the Workers' Party and the Workers' State put energy into the efforts. Part 20. East Germany in the 1970s. The lesbian and gay movement blossoms. Quote, "The legal situation of GDR, or East German, gays improved considerably in 1968 with the elimination of paragraph 175, historian Jim Stakely concluded in his published research. He credited the abolition of the almost century-old Prussian anti-homosexual law to the pioneering work of Dr. Rudolf Klimmer, a gay communist physician. This move, part of an overhaul of the criminal code, elevated the GDR to the same progressive level as Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, which also decriminalized homosexuality in the mid-1960s. Writing in 1976, the Canadian researcher described an East German gay population characterized by long-term relationships, apparently more so than in West Germany or in the United States. Quote, "The durability of such relationships may also reflect the relative lack of anomie and competitiveness in socialist society, yet the prevalence of gay couples is all the more striking in light of the fact that at 50% and still climbing, the GDR's divorce rate is the highest in the world. Although it deserves a more detailed analysis," he continued, "GDR citizens properly interpret the divorce rate as an index of women's emancipation rather than social collapse. In any case, the gay couples are seldom burdened by the ideology of pure monogamy, and affairs on the side, as well as casual sexual encounters, are standard. Parks, beaches, where nude bathing is widespread, and other public places have never been the locus of police entrapment, and arrests for public indecency are virtually unknown." Unquote. However, one last thorn of legal discrimination remained in the body of East German law. While the age of sexual consent was the same for same-sex and heterosexual minors, under the provisions of paragraphs 150 and 151, homosexual adults penalized for relationships with underage youths could be sentenced to 3 years behind bars, while heterosexuals only faced 2-year sentences. Stakely met with Klimmer during his research in the GDR. Quote, "Dr. Klimmer regards it as his greatest success," he reported, "that these paragraphs explicitly contain a provision allowing prison terms to be suspended in favor of probation, and court practice shows that this option has been widely adopted in cases which do not involve assault or coercion." Unquote. Before the GDR was overturned, even this legal inequity was removed. Housing and employment, however, continued to be sites of struggles for equality after 1961. Partly, this was due to lack of resources in the workers' state that made the early goal of socialism, equal distribution, difficult to attain. And age-old prejudice was also an obstacle. Stakely gave voice to the frustration of gays with the GDR's governmental housing agency, which allocated space based on family size. This made it virtually impossible for single men to rent more than a studio apartment. But he did not examine the social crisis out of its economic context. Quote, "Housing is still at a premium in the GDR, and it was only in 1975 that Berlin, for example, attained the per capita level of housing that it had prior to World War II. In order to keep the country from sinking below its current zero population growth, the government makes no bones about rewarding childbirth. And while abortion and contraceptives are freely available, premarital sex and unmarried motherhood are promoted in pop songs." Unquote. While the housing crunch Stakely described in 1976 constrained singles, he found that gays in East Germany were, quote, "optimistic that the GDR's ongoing, high-priority construction program will open new options within the next decade." Unquote. When examining the housing crisis in the GDR, it's important to reiterate that, by law, rent could not exceed 10% of an individual's income. Rent could not exceed 10% of an individual's income. And when it came to jobs, Stakely stressed, quote, "Homosexuals are occasionally fired by a homophobic superior, but gays have successfully argued their cases in special GDR workers' courts and had their jobs restored with back pay." Unquote. Unlike a capitalist economic system, where wages are always in danger of being driven down by an army of unemployed competing against the employed, jobs are a right in a planned economy. Stakely stressed, quote, "In a country with the right, not the obligation, to work and a serious labor shortage, job performance has become the sole criterion for hiring and firing," unquote. A flowering of lesbian and gay subculture. In his 10 pages of results of a study of the lesbian and gay movement in the GDR, published in 1989, researcher John Parsons explained that during the 1950s and 60s, an underground gay subculture had developed. But, he continued, quote, "The 1970s and early 1980s were a time when this lesbian and gay subculture grew and flowered, creating a broad self-consciousness and assertiveness," unquote. The Berlin Association for Homosexual Concerns, or HIB, was established in the spring of 1972 by both women and men. They organized public and private discussion groups and programs, held film showings and book readings, and hosted speakers from the fields of medicine, psychology, and sociology. Stakely added an important point about the class character of the association. Quote, "Unlike most gay organizations in West Germany, the HIB is largely made up of workers and professional people rather than students," unquote. 2 of the 3 members of the steering committee belonged to the Communist Party. Parsons noted the role of women. Quote, "Parallel with these efforts, lesbians and feminists were organizing their own discussion groups centered on questions of women's liberation," unquote. He added that, although public discussion focused on male same-sexuality, quote, "One fact that is striking, however, is that lesbian and gay cultural institutions and friendship circles in East Germany historically have been integrated much more across gender lines than those in either West Germany or the United States," unquote. Stakely, writing closer to the period of the formation of HIB, said that while the organization waited until 1976 to apply for state recognition, quote, "It by no means had an underground status during its first 4 years," unquote. In its first year, the group approached the Ministry of Health to request public meeting space, but the HIB delegation angrily withdrew its request after a psychiatrist offered to turn those weekly meetings into group therapy. So the group turned to the National Labor Union, the FDGB. Stakely reported, quote, "The FDGB was unable to provide rooms but urged the HIB to continue its search, noting that gays had legitimate concerns and should not be required to continue meeting in private homes," unquote. He added that activists protested a lack of protection from anti-gay bashers to the Berlin police, quote, "and the HIB got a positive response," unquote. The group also lodged complaints with city administrators when one of Berlin's gay bars was closed in 1975. Quote, "Protests to municipal authorities brought assurances that the measure was not intentionally anti-gay, but part of a larger urban renewal program designed to enhance the capital's cosmopolitan character, which would soon lead to the opening of several new bars, quote, for every taste," unquote. And Parsons pointed out that during the 1970s, a number of gay-identified clubs and cafes opened up in major East German cities. Answering the Rat Man. On June 1, 1976, HIB organized a very successful forum publicly sponsored by the Urania Society, a public education agency. The event, a talk by Dr. Peter G. Clem entitled Sex Roles in Socialist Society, filled the meeting hall to capacity. Of the 500 who attended, only an estimated 1/3 were gay or lesbian. Clem's speech and the discussion that followed demonstrated a progressive current in a raging polemic against the work of Dr. Günther Dorner, a Berlin endocrinology researcher dubbed Rat Man by HIB activists. Dorner claimed to be able to produce homosexual or heterosexual litters of rats based on injecting pregnant rats at different stages in the gestation period. Stakely emphasized, quote, "Dorner's experiments raised the specter of pregnant women being tested for hormonal, quote, normalcy and given booster shots if the results indicate that the fetus is homosexual," unquote. East German gays and lesbians recalled all too well that under capitalism, the fascist eugenics wing of biological determinism rose to power with Nazism. But in the GDR, Dorner's theories and the faction of science he represented did not prevail. Clem argued against drawing broad generalizations about human sexuality based on animal research. His eloquent elaboration of this position, clarifying even today, appeared in a 1975 article in Verdicht, a women's magazine with the largest circulation in the GDR. Quote, "It is one of many human achievements to have liberated sexuality from its function as biological reproduction, and to have made it into an independent source of pleasure and life enrichment. Once we have acknowledged this and have accepted the fundamentally human and therefore social function of sexuality, we must also grant that the source of pleasure cannot be set by biological criteria. The wrong taste in pleasure cannot be declared a sickness in need of treatment. Homosexuals suffer only in an intolerant milieu. Homosexuality is a form of, quote, deviance only in terms of traditional sex role concepts. Any halfway imaginative heterosexual couple deviates from the, quote, natural, e.g. the sexual behavior of rats, just as much as a homosexual couple. It is therefore quite proper to doubt whether the problem of bi, homo, or hyposexuality can actually be solved with a shot of hormones in the 4th month of pregnancy, or even should be. Changes in the traditional concept of sex roles are certainly the more correct, and above all the humane approach, and these remarks are intended as a contribution to that goal, unquote. Stakely concluded in 1976 that these views by Dr. Clem were a, quote, sample of the progressive psychological standpoint, which is becoming increasingly influential in the GDR. It is perhaps significant that the founding of the gay movement has come since 1971, when the government announced that the GDR had achieved the level of a, quote, developed socialist society, and could now begin to lay the groundwork for the transition to communism. Not just experts, but gay people from all walks of life are playing a role in the broad, democratic discussion of the socialist personality and sexuality, feminism, and the future of the family, unquote. That was East Germany in the 1970s, but by the 1980s, efforts by the Communist Party and the state created a historic milestone for same-sex emancipation.